Hi, everybody. I am the Director of Strategy at California Institute for Behavioral Health Solutions, and I'm going to be introducing you to our presenters today. We have had both of these wonderful presenters speak with us on past webinars in these series, and so I'm excited to have them back today. Elizabeth Morrison is the CEO of EM Consulting. She's a licensed clinical social worker, and she has a master's in addiction counseling. As a practicing clinician, Elizabeth has been providing services to individuals insured by Medi-Cal and uninsured patients in primary care clinics using telephone and video and text ever since we began the shelter-in-place order. She has over 15 years of experience in developing effective and sustainable integrated behavioral health services in primary care organizations. She wrote the first widely distributed how-to manual on integrated behavioral health. She's a thought leader in the field. She's served on integrated care advisory boards for the California Primary Care Association and the UCSF School of Medicine. She's an expert motivational interviewing trainer and has been providing research-based training and train the trainer courses in motivational interviewing and other empathy-based communications for the past 20 years. Rick GOSCHA is Senior Vice President for the California Institute for Behavioral Health Solutions. He has over 30 years of experience in behavioral health, including provision of clinical services, supervision and program management, agency executive leadership, research and evaluation, and policy development. He has previously worked as the director of the University of Kansas Center for Mental Health Research and Innovation. And Rick is recognized nationally and internationally for work that he's done around the strengths model and other recovery-oriented evidence-based practices for individuals with serious mental illness. His extensive work around building systemic infrastructures that support recovery-oriented practices, enhancing skill development through field mentoring, and making client-centered, making use of data to guide program improvement efforts and using client-centered leadership practices which have been translated into positive outcomes for behavioral health organizations. He's an internationally renowned speaker and author, and in addition to having published numerous articles and book chapters, Rick has also done a number of different keynote speeches and presentations. He's a co-author along with Charles Rapp of the Strengths Model, a recovery-oriented approach to mental health services. It's now in its third edition. Okay, now I'd like to turn this over to our wonderful presenters.
Looks like I'm still waiting for Elizabeth to join us.
I'm sorry. I wasn't really late. I was here. I'm so sorry.
I thought maybe it was like a trick, and it's like, okay, here you go.
Hi, everybody. I was just staying up because you're starting us out, but I'll just say hi and then I'll go off until I come back.
All right. Okay. Well, hi everyone. I'm really really appreciative of just having this opportunity to be back to speak at one of these webinars for the Minimizing Disruptions in Care series. You know, I did the webinar just a few weeks ago on effective supervision when working remotely, but this particular webinar is really near and dear to me because it's also very personal. You know, my experiences with behavioral health services it extended way before that I was ever employed by an organization that provided behavioral health, or working at the University of Kansas or at CIBHS supporting the design and implementation of recovery-oriented practices within the behavioral health system. You know, I have both family and personal lived experiences, and my perspectives are really shaped by my own journey. And I've seen the good and the bad of behavioral health. My collective family experiences have included multiple local and state hospitalizations, forced medications, completed suicides, substance use, domestic violence, child welfare involvement, just to name a few. And while my experiences, you know, it doesn't mean that I know the right pathway to recovery for everyone. it has made me aware of just how individualized, subjective, and complex each person's recovery journey is. You know, the pathway is never simple, and it can be joyous and liberating at times, but it also can be painful. You know, there's always a story, a very unique story behind each person's, each family's recovery journey. And that is what has inspired me just to enter this field and even continue in it with so much of a passion. I really truly do believe in just the resiliency and capability of people. And I've had the privilege of intersecting with thousands of storylines and voices over the past 30 years as a behavioral health professional. And behind each of those storylines is just the dignity and worth of a person, you know, not a client, but a person. So staying focused and aligning with people around long-term recovery goals is really at its core a willingness for us to invest in the life and the well-being of another person. Next slide, please. So since recovery is a key term in the title of this webinar, I think it's important that we unpack that term a bit here. You know, recovery has been a term that has become deeply embedded in our behavioral health vernacular. You know, we see it in mission and vision statements. We see posters on recovery in our waiting rooms. We see it in program flyers. We do significant amounts of strategic planning initiatives to become more recovery oriented as organizations. But what exactly do we mean by recovery? So on the screen is probably the most widely used definition of recovery in the behavioral health services field, and that's from SAMHSA, the Substance Use and Mental Health Services Administration. And while it is a relatively short and compact definition, it is packed with important concepts that tell us a little bit about what recovery is versus not. You know, recovery is not a cure, but it rather is a process of change. It's not just a passive acceptance, but rather about having an active role in things that impact a person's life and their health and their well-being. It implies an emphasis on choice and autonomy of the person. Recovery is not just about stabilization and maintenance, but really it's about striving to reach one's full potential. So it's a good basic definition of recovery, especially when you add in the 4 dimensions that support recovery that's on the screen. Next slide, Robin. But I do want to push us just a little bit further around this definition of recovery and maybe open up some space for us to think about some very tangible aspects of recovery that people build their life around. And why would this be important? Because it's one thing for us to be philosophically aligned with the concept of recovery, but it is another for us to look closely at how exactly we are aligning with people we serve to help them make movement in these types of areas that actually may help them move past our system of care. So by showing you these key recovery-oriented outcome indicators, it doesn't take away anything from the individualized, the subjective, and the unique pathway of recovery for any of us. But it doesn't even require that people have goals in each of these areas, or it doesn't give us permission to impose what we think people should do. But my intention is to really set a high aim for our behavioral health system, and even for each of us as individuals who work with people within the behavioral health system, to really challenge us to explore the full range of possibilities and to continuously strive to create opportunities for people to build lives in their communities, very similar to how people who are not receiving behavioral health services strive to build their lives and achieve their full potential. So think for a moment just about your own lives. You know, each of us probably carved a life for ourselves around one or more of these areas, most likely all 5 of these areas. You know, people build their lives around where they live and where they work and what we know. We build a life around the people that we interact with, people that we love and care about, and people that care about us. We build a life around what we do and where we find connection and inclusion within our community. And this doesn't mean that we've always been successful in everything that we've done, that we've found exactly what we were looking for in any of these areas, that we haven't had to at times start over and rebuild our lives, that we aren't still striving or trying to build or rebuild a life. But these are core areas that people in general build their life around, including the people who receive behavioral health services. So it is important, as we start talking about staying focused and aligning with people around long-term recovery goals, that we do listen very intently to what people are telling us about what they desire or aspire to in their life. And it's more than just symptoms, it's more than just behaviors. And even being attentive to what people do not say when it seems like they've given up hope on what is possible. I think it is important that we raise the expectations of what we think people are able to accomplish. Even in this time, in the presence of COVID-19, especially if we tear down these false lines that separate the desires and aspirations of the people we serve from the desires and aspirations that we hold in common as people. I think it's also important to acknowledge as we progress through this webinar that there are so many factors that impact a person's ability to achieve goals in these 5 key recovery-oriented outcome areas. And it's more than just symptoms of a mental illness or behaviors or an addiction. We really do need to acknowledge that there are real structural barriers related to race and ethnicity, gender identity, etc., that impede people's ability to make movement in these areas. We need to acknowledge that there are institutionalized inequities that are embedded within our society that unjustly put key elements of recovery out of reach for far too many people. My own recovery journey had its own barriers and challenges, but at the same time, I also benefited from a white and male privilege that I did not earn, but rather was born into, that kept a pathway open for me to advance in several of these areas. So while we need to find ways to align with people on a macro level on their long-term recovery goals, we must also acknowledge that everyone's recovery journey does not start on an equal playing field. And many people's mental health, including symptoms and emotions and behaviors, and even their sense of hope, is impacted by these macro level factors. Next slide, please. I also want to acknowledge that our work with people around recovery is not always going to revolve around one of these 5 key recovery-oriented outcome areas. Life happens. People have immediate needs. Sometimes pressing concerns can consume a person's focus and elevate the need for something to have immediate attention. And I've only listed just a few of these other important areas that we may focus our help around at any particular point in time. But I think it's important, as we are trying to find alignment with people in their recovery, that we don't ignore the potential relationship between these areas of concern of people and those key recovery-oriented outcome indicators. People often come into our services because of a presenting problem. And while it is important for us to address presenting problems, we also need to be careful that we do not remain stuck in a cycle of merely identifying problems, resolving problems, and then waiting for the next problem to be identified. So hear me really clearly on this. Supporting people in their recovery does not mean that we ignore problems, barriers, and challenges that people experience. That would be completely invalidating. But we also need to recognize that people do not build a life around just not having problems or not having symptoms or not using or not having legal challenges. Truly being recovery oriented means pushing further. It's about creating space for people to make movement beyond our system of care. Next slide, please. So on the screen, I provided just a few examples of how some of the areas on that previous slide can be positioned within key recovery-oriented goals that may be relevant and meaningful and important to people. So we always start where people are currently at, but sometimes even just a few simple questions or just the time actively listening to people can help us make those links and connections with the people that we're working with. So an example might be around health and diabetes. So I'll be really upfront here. I'm at high risk for diabetes, especially when you consider my family history. But when I look at like all the things that it takes to lower my risk, I don't really see a lot of things that completely excite me or even motivate me to change my current behaviors. But I do love my family, and I love the specific things that I'm able to currently do with them. And the thought of that ever changing is a motivator for me. So getting at the why of something's important tells us a lot about how we can align with a person in their recovery. You know, people may not want to build a life around just managing diabetes, but people do build their life around their family and what they do with their family. The same could be said of exploring why a person would want to stay out of the hospital or do the hard work around being sober or the lengthy process of working through a legal issue or having tolerance for a side effect of a medication that they also find offers them a benefit in their life. Next slide, please. So lastly, just in this introduction section, I want to talk about some things that people may really want. You know, those 5 key recovery-oriented outcome indicators are their general areas around which people build their life. But within each of those areas are packed with a substantial amount of meaning that make it personal and unique to that individual. Next slide, Robin. So I want to introduce the concept of active ingredients. To kind of represent what people are often really looking for when they express any goal. You know, we use the word goals a lot in behavioral health services. You know, we have treatment plans or client plans that ask us to state people's goals. You know, even the title of this webinar is around aligning with people around their long-term recovery goals. But a lot of us in our lives don't always just speak about goals. Sometimes, you know, we throw something out there, but it isn't always the thing that we're actually looking for. So getting alignment with people is really about connecting with them around the core meaning that they assign to anything that they say. You know, I always like to view a goal as a visual or a verbalized representation of just all these hopes and dreams and expectations, and ultimately the internal effect that a person believes will be derived by achieving a desired goal that they speak of. Next slide, Robin. So here are just a few examples. There's so many that you could really go over. And these are 2 goals. I want to be in relationship. I want to exercise, that you may have heard many different people express. But for each person, what they truly hope will be the outcome of that exact same stated goal can be completely different. So in finding alignment with people around their recovery goals, we need to have as much understanding as we can, and to the degree to which people are willing to share this with us, about what they hope will be the outcome of that goal. So an example starter conversation might be, so tell me a little bit more about your desire to start exercising, or tell me about the importance of being in a relationship right now for you. You know, I've seen so many clinicians, workers, etc., including myself at times, who have quickly jumped on a stated goal that a person expressed and started pushing toward movement. You know, I mean, many of us are action-oriented people. You know, we love a good, tangible goal, you know, like exercise, yay, you know, what a great recovery goal. You know, I'm so happy you're taking care of your health and well-being. You know, we get excited about it, and we want the best for people, and we want movement. But sometimes if we just take the time to even further explore something like this with someone, we may actually find out that the person actually hates exercise and would actually prefer not to do it. But what they do desire is to be in a relationship with someone for maybe whom exercise is important. So the goal really isn't exercise, even though that may be what was verbalized. It is to be in a relationship. And I think the importance of understanding this key difference is critical. You know, one creates multiple pathways for how something might be accomplished, even if the stated goal is not achieved, if they're looking for the active ingredient. You know, and this doesn't mean that we discourage people from exercising if they say they want to exercise, but it does mean that our alignment is going to occur around the active ingredient that the person actually wants to achieve. So something like, you know, I hear that developing a relationship with this person is important to you, and you see exercising as a way to connect with this person. You know, so it's trying to position exactly where it is that people are really focusing on. So I just wanted to set up the concept of active ingredients. We'll return to this a little more later, but now I'm going to officially turn it back over to Elizabeth to explore a few other concepts with you.
Thanks, I came on quick. I didn't want to leave you hanging this time. So
Thank you. Oh, I appreciate that.
Thank you, Rick. You can go to the next slide. Thank you, Robin. You know, I just realized that on this slide I have animations in it, so you might need to click a few times for them to show up. I just wanted to thank you, Rick, for that lead-in and really beautiful overview of the really important aspects, not just for the people that we're working with, but for us too, when we think about our goals and what is deeply motivating to us in terms of going forward in the decisions that we make. And I want to just pick up on that piece about the active ingredient where Rick left off and talk about eliciting values. So for all of us, when we're working with others and when we're setting goals for ourselves too, in terms of how we talk to ourselves and our friends and the people around us, intrinsic motivation is when there's that active ingredient that Rick was talking about, and when there's something that's in alignment with our values. And it is accurate, I think, to say that all of us, in a general sense, probably want very similar things. You know, happiness, health, you know, to love and be loved, and so there is some similarity in being human in this world. And there's a lot of really specific and unique things about all of us in terms of what we most deeply value. I'm sure many of you have looked at those like a values, you know, sheet that has like 200 values on it or something like that. And the exercise is to, you know, pick 10, and then you go down to 8, and then you go down to 5, and then it's like, what are your top 3? And it's really hard because they're all super positive, and they're all things that we like and enjoy and think are important. And the process of kind of sifting down is really instructive to see, oh, these are sort of the deepest values in my life that have driven my daily actions, driven my larger life goals. You know, for some people it might be community, it might be connection. For some people it might be family, it might be discovery or courage or exploration, it might be justice and equality and fairness, you know, it might be fun and humor and laughing, and you know, it's part of what makes us such unique individuals. And so within these core areas that Rick is talking about, that sort of active ingredient is very unique. And so when we're working with others, to really just be able to say directly to people, it sounds like, you know, X is really important to you. I can't tell you how many times I say that to clients, just to say, gosh, I'm really hearing how much lifelong learning or personal growth is important to you. I'm really hearing how much faith is important to you. You know, as you're listening to them, you can kind of hear these clues about how they're thinking about things, how they're making decisions, you know, what they've done in their life. And we can start to sort of summarize some of that and hand it back and see, did we get that right? It sounds like this is really important to you. Let's go to the next slide. These are two of my favorite really direct questions. When we're asking people, what do they most value? Often another way of saying that is, you know, what's really, really important to you? And then, like I said, out of those sort of maybe things that we have in common as humans, you know, how can we sort of drill down and find out what exactly are the most important things? I often do this when I'm talking to people just for the first time, just to get a sense of them. You know, tell me a little bit about what's really important to you. And to Rick's point about sort of how problem focused we can get, and I always say that I am very problem focused. I have been that way since I was a kid. Like, I was the kid who was always like talking about what was wrong, what's wrong in this family that I'm in that's super dysfunctional, like what's wrong with me, what's wrong with my body. I am a super good editor because like I've always been able to look at things really quickly and see all the things that are wrong with it. And then I wanted to become a therapist, and probably in part because, you know, I wanted to see what was wrong. I can see what's wrong. And I'm afraid that early in my career, it was like, if you didn't bring enough problems, I would find some for you and hand them back to you. So I just want to say that, like, I come from that place where I feel like I've really had a transformation, I would say, in the last 10 years about really, really learning and believing and looking for, like, I have different glasses on now. I have strength glasses, I have values glasses, and I just put them on, and all of a sudden it's like a black light. Like, you just see like so many things that are important to people, and to kind of hold those at least equal in some ways to the difficulties that people might also be bringing to us. You can go to the next slide, Robin. So I just wanted to share a little example that I had in my own life in the last about 30 days that was such a reminder to me as I was preparing for this webinar, as Rick and I were having these discussions. And that is that this is my daughter. She's 15. The picture on the left is what I would consider her daily life since March 23rd, the shelter-in-place order. And I have like many, I'm sure, people who have children in their life, I have a bunch of like kind of constant worries about her. And one of them is that she just seems so like lethargic and kind of like sedentary. And I'm like worried, you know, how much Netflix can you watch? And like, can you just like focus on school a little bit more? No, there's no motivation, you know, to focus on school. I'm getting my third quarter grades. And so this was like her life, right? And I'm busy working, and then I come out and like, oh, you know, what are you doing? Can you get up? Why don't you do this? Why don't you do that? And kind of forgetting all of my professional skills, all my training in motivational interviewing. I'm really just kind of scolding and pushing her. And of course, I can get her to do stuff short term, like any extrinsically motivated, you know, task. What happened though was she got very extremely fired up about the racial justice protests, and really kind of convinced our family that she needed to be there, and here's how we were going to do it safely. And she was so motivated about this. And then from the time that we've come home, the picture on the far right is like, it was just like 3 days ago, and I said, can I take a picture of you with that? She came out to the living room. She has pages and pages and pages and pages of writing. And what she's been doing is like researching all around sort of police department and ethical codes and rules and regulation and how that fits in with community and different procedures. And I realized all of a sudden, she's always been really interested in fairness and justice. And then I remembered that 2 years ago when we left the country and she was having trouble making friends, that the point where she actually made friends is when they started going to climate change protests together. They were taking the train together. And all of a sudden I could see back that this is a deep value of hers, and that this is very intrinsically motivating to her, and that she has done more in the last month than I was able to push her to do in the 60 days before that. And it was such a reminder for me in my own life that Our job is to elevate and elicit and find out what people value and kind of throw fertilizer and support on that, as opposed to sort of pushing from the outside around areas that might not be that important to them. That's it. Let's go to the next slide. Or that's it on this, yeah. I just wanted to say something about autonomy. The other thing that sort of squashes natural motivation around goals is when people feel like they don't have autonomy, when they feel like they have to do it. And even though none of us, I think, as helping professionals ever purposely want to sort of take autonomy away from people, autonomy is actually a very specific communication strategy that we can employ to sort of throw that fertilizer and support toward others for their goals. And one of them is to, one of the specific communication strategies is to avoid words that indicate a lack of autonomy, and then to acknowledge autonomy. So instead of just believing that people are autonomous, you can go to the next slide, we can actually try to weed out those words in our vocabulary like must or have to. You know what you have to do. You need to go to the hospital the next time this happens. It's really important. You really must stop drinking. You really should, quit smoking. We have a lot of these words that come really naturally. And in fact, now that I'm super sensitized to these words, I catch myself saying them a lot. Like I have consciousness about it and I see them pop up all the time. And often we're doing this when we're really concerned about someone. So we're pushing a little bit. And sometimes they're just built into our field. People don't need to do, they don't must, they don't should, they don't need to do anything. And instead we can replace that with really affirming autonomy. It's your choice, it's your decision, whatever you think is best. I worked for a long time with someone who used to say, you're the boss, what are your thoughts? So that's a communication strategy that actually increases motivation naturally toward what people feel like is really important. Let's go to the next slide. The principle at play with autonomy is psychological resistance, and I just love this comic. Psychological resistance is sort of this human tendency to push back when we feel pushed. And so when I talk about affirming autonomy and how important it is to sort of actively verbally affirm autonomy and avoid those lack of autonomy words, it's really because we want to avoid someone pushing back on us. And we all do this. I mean, so some of us sort of fight back, the minute someone says you have to do this, it's like, oh, really? Like, dukes up kind of thing. And other people respond differently. Some people get a little more passive and like, okay, but then won't do it. We all, though, have different ways of sort of pushing back. And it's one of the very subtle ways that we can cause harm sometimes with people when we're pushing, and we've ended up giving them a lot of practice pushing back on something that's actually important and something even that they might want to do. But we've sort of taken away that motivation with the pushing too hard, like I did with my daughter, probably creating more time in the bed on the headphones with my pushing. Okay, so let's go to the next slide. We're gonna switch now. That Rick and I were sort of reviewing some of the fundamental foundational pieces about goals and goal setting. And we wanted to talk just for a few minutes about the very specific challenges, particularly right now in this time, in the context of this larger webinar series. A couple of the challenges that we've noticed have come up. Can you go to the next slide, Robin? So one of the first things that I wanted to just ask everybody is, I mean, the last 3 months have been, sort of, I had a colleague say, the sort of assumptive reality of how our world works has sort of been, taken away. I was saying this morning in sort of in an AA meeting that I was in, so it's sort of, spiritual context. that I think, we never really know what the future holds, but often we have some sort of false sense of security because we look at things that haven't changed in the past and kind of assume going forward that they won't change. And this is a time where we don't have that. Most of us don't have that right now. And so it does present a particular type of challenge when we're working with clients, in that it is a different time. There are different barriers, and some of our goals have been put off, postponed, changed, some of the things that we might have been able to advance faster in some goals. So I just wanted to ask everybody today who's on the webinar, and I wish I could ask you all in person. I really wish I could see everybody's faces. That's one of the things I find challenging about this. So I'm envisioning, your faces, putting my arms around everybody. So I wanted to ask if everyone could do a poll real quick. I would love to just get a little pulse check on this in terms of our own goals. So Robin, if you can launch the poll. How have recent world events impacted your ability and willingness to focus on and work toward your own long-term goals? So I'd love to hear this from everyone. And I know we can't ask open-ended questions on the poll, so that's a bummer because I'm sure some of these don't fit everybody. If you can just check, which ones you think are most fit, and you can actually check more than one, because I think some people, I think I'm between maybe 3 and 4 on here. So if you're between ones, you can also pick 2. But let me just give you just a few more seconds if you can click on that, and we'll kind of see where everybody is. You tell us when, Robin.
Kirsten, can you see how many people have answered?
Yes, about 50% and climbing right now have answered.
All right, we'll just give just a couple more minutes for those of you who would like to fill this out. I feel like, for myself, I have kind of a standing goal to spend more time alone with my kids, like sort of one-on-one. It's been hard, just in general in my life, working full-time, et cetera, like most of you. And I feel like that has gotten, that goal I've actually been able to move towards during this pandemic. And then I was just talking to Rick and Jen Clancy before we started this webinar that my academic goals had kind of been waylaid. I've just had to almost just set them down and not move forward at all. Okay, let's see the results, Robin. Yeah, so many of you, it looks like the majority of you sort of relate to what I just said, that it fast-tracked some goals and totally waylaid others. So 30% no changes, and some of you don't have long-term goals, not formally anyway. And yeah, almost 30% mostly stop working toward goals, still in crisis mode. Thank you for everyone who answered that. You can close that, Robin, and go to the next slide. Thank you for doing that. I appreciate that. So of course, the people that we're working with, are very similar right there. They're right there with us. And so a full 30% perhaps haven't been able to sort of get refocused or work on long-term recovery goals. So I wanted to just talk about one more strategy, I wanted to switch to strategies and talk about a really specific, practical questions that can help us like dig down and get in with people and sort of, get in with them about goals and figure out how we can help them get refocused and continue to work on long-term goals. And the first one is this difference between checking in, how's your week going, and digging in. How are you doing with blank? And I'm sure all of you who, have seen clients and patients for many years, decades, some of you on the phone, recognize what the difference is here. So how is your week going is not a question that's going to ask someone to go deep. And in fact, I'm sure many of you have had clients or patients that you could see regularly and do this every week. How is your week going? And it never really gets deep. It never gets down because it doesn't necessarily have to be about me or the person that you're asking. I could tell you all kinds of things that happened this week and not talk about myself. And so on our end, when we're helping professionals, one of the ways that we can really help people with their goals during a period of time like this in particular is to make sure that we're asking questions that indicate we are digging in. Can you go to the next slide, Robin? Here's my example of that. This is my best friend, Lisa. We grew up, we're both from Alaska. We grew up in Alaska together. She's my best friend. She lives in New York City now. This was a couple years ago when I was visiting her. And sometimes I don't see her for a year. Sometimes I don't talk to her for months. And as soon as I see her, we don't even say, how are you? We don't even do that. It's like, well, often I say to her, what do you need to tell me? And she'll say, what do you need to tell me? Like, we just dig in. It's like, go deep really fast and get in there really fast. So in some ways, that's exactly what I'm talking about in terms of with our clients and really supporting that focus on longer term recovery goals. Let's go to the next slide. And this is just another example of checking in versus digging in. When somebody starts telling us about an interaction with their sister, with a family member, with their probation officer, you know, with their ex-wife, if we say, what did she say, right? Then we get into this like kind of very sort of shallow interactions with our clients or patients where they're like, and then she said this, and then he said this, and then she, you know, and you're thinking, oh no, we are not on fertile ground here. And you're really not, because it's a reporting about what's happening to someone. So the slight change for digging in is to say, you know, how was that for you to say that to her? How was that for you when this person said that to you? What was your experience of that? Wow, that took a lot of courage. That seems like it would have taken a lot of courage for you to say that to draw those boundaries with your brother. How was that for you, as opposed to how did he respond to that? So just like a really slight difference to help us like dig in and go deep. So I'll stop there and turn it over to Rick.
All right, thanks, Elizabeth. I really like some of the things that you've put on about just the words that you use, and they are so critical in terms of interacting with people. And I know you only had the opportunity to put up just kind of a few phrases and words, but you know, all of that is so much embedded in our overall practice approach. You know, so I want to talk just a little bit about our practice approach and how it can impact our ability to align with people and stay focused on their long-term recovery goals. So when I'm talking about practice approach, I'm not talking about the particular model that you may use in your practice or your practice orientation, but actually something a little more general about the way that we actually bring ourselves into that helping relationship, you know, our core thoughts and beliefs about people, and our reactions, both internal and external, to what people say and what they do. You know, as a person who is a co-developer of a model with specific practice tools, I'm a very firm believer that the most important tool in any model is the worker themselves, which is why I think it is so critical in recovery-oriented practice to continuously learn and grow and understand that what we do and what we say, our way of being in relationship with people, does have an impact on the lives of the people that we work with. So I'm not placing any judgment on the way of practice, on any way of practice using these two axes on your screen. And I'm polarizing some of these approaches to the extremes just to make a point. So when I look at my own practice, you know, even when I have tried my best to operate under a specific model of practice with a defined philosophical set of beliefs and values, I still have found myself shifting away from what I knew deep down inside to be good practice, because I wasn't always aware of my own implicit biases, or what kind of things triggered various behavioral responses from me. And as I started to be more self-reflective in my practice, I found that there were these subtle shifts in how I responded to people. And sometimes this even varied from person to person. And sometimes it was even dependent upon the goal that a person had that was verbalized, or even different goals from the same person. And these responses were so subtle that even if someone at one point would have pointed out to me that I was doing this, I would have said, no way, no way. I'm recovery oriented. I treat people equally, and I'm accepting of all people, and I validate their goals. It's a beautiful way to view ourselves, but when I'm completely honest, I can admit that there have been times over the course of my work as a clinician where I have unintentionally been an additional barrier to someone making movement towards a desired goal. Even when I approach something with the absolute best of intentions. So it's always good for us to be aware of our practice approaches, and especially I think during times like now, where we may be working with people through virtual sessions. There's a lot of uncertainty, as Elizabeth mentioned, in the world right now. There's a lot of unknowns. And sometimes when this occurs, that we can have that tendency to move our approaches more to the extremes, especially when we feel outside of our own comfort zone, or not having as much control as we may have felt we had when we were actually in person and face to face with people. So we may feel the need to protect people more now. We may tend to be more directive with people about what they should do. We can also be at a point where sometimes we personally feel just so overwhelmed by all the things that are going around us. And sometimes we feel more comfortable if maybe people put some aspects of their recovery journey on hold for a bit, or feel more comfortable just nurturing people and processing feelings rather than finding ways to align with people on specific action steps, maybe even supporting a person to take a risk on something that maybe even we don't completely feel sure about. Next slide, Robin. So this is all not to deny some of the incredible recovery-oriented practice that continues to be done right now, even virtually. I've been working with several California counties where I've been just completely amazed at just the things that people have been able to accomplish during this time, and even finding ways to continue on in their recovery journey and even thrive. But right now in this part of the webinar, we're talking about challenges, and when things become difficult around supporting a person in their recovery journey, or when things get stagnated. And I always think it is important to look at ourselves as workers first. This is not to say that we're to blame for when things go wrong, but if we go back to the idea of the worker themselves being a vital tool in the helping relationship, we really do want to make sure that we are well positioned to be able to support the person, no matter where they are in their journey. Because for every recovery journey, there are already so many significant challenges and barriers and obstacles that people will face. We just never want to be another one of those. So in being more self-reflective, I think it's important for us to be honest with our narratives that may be underneath any emotional state that we might experience as a result of a person expressing a goal, or even the way that they might approach a goal, or their life journey in general. There's a myriad of internal responses that workers can have when people are talking about their goals, but I've only put up just three common ones that I've encountered even just here in just the past few months. And once again, how we feel does not necessarily have to come from a bad place. It can arise from our sincere care and concern for a person. Like just thinking, I really worry about what might happen if. This narrative can be grounded in fear, We have because we don't want anything bad to happen to another person. You know, but just like with narratives of the people that we serve may hold, we can't expect that you're just going to turn these things off. It's just sometimes what we think and what we feel. We can just sometimes own those things. But it is important that we do take ownership of those narratives that we have and be aware of how this narrative can impact our behaviors then related to a person's recovery journey. You know, because it may lead to things where we try to control the situation and steer a person down a pathway that we feel most comfortable with. Or it may actually lead us to neglect helping a person to make movement towards something that they desire. You know, of course, our narratives can also come from a place of judgment. And if we held a negative view of the person and their recovery journey prior to COVID-19, then it's highly likely that those narratives have continued in this virtual space in which may be currently working with people. All right, next slide, Robin. So we want to shift into some strategies, and the way I'm going to approach this is by using a process for doing goal-related work that I've used to guide my own sessions with people related to recovery when I was meeting with people in person and face-to-face. But I've also introduced this process during the work that I've done with teams here in California and even nationally and internationally doing strengths model implementation. And people have responded that they feel that this process works extremely well when supporting people in virtual sessions. But I want to draw back to a few earlier thoughts about recovery so that I can position this process in light of a person's recovery journey and aligning with them. You know, first of all, we do have to recognize that recovery is a process. You know, it's not just about reaching any specific goal or milestone. You know, there doesn't always have to be a rush to get to anywhere. Or go in any particular direction, you know, unless that's really dictated by the person whose recovery journey this is. And we must always remember that this is not our journey. You know, if we have the privilege of being able to walk with a person for any portion of that journey, that is really significant enough. But that also doesn't mean that we have to be a passive bystander. You know, one of our greatest roles, I think, in supporting people around their goals and their recovery is really opening up space for movement. So we really do need to view each session with a person for just what it is. It's an opportunity to create space, an opportunity for movement. It's just one moment in time that is connected to a larger journey the person has already been traversing and will continue to travel. And so that's why I really like the photos, Elizabeth, that you showed of your daughter. You know, that if you focus in at any one point in time, you may see your daughter with headphones and in her bed. But if you look at another point in time, you see your daughter out, you know, marching with other people. You view that person that's out there, you know, writing things and researching and exploring. So we always really have to think about, you know, each session for what it is. It's a point in time. It's a point in time where there's an opportunity just to create space and movement. So next slide, Robin, and I'm going to go to the one on capturing key drivers. So I'm not going to talk any more about, you know, listening to people and being empathic, you know, not because that's not important, but because Elizabeth has already kind of touched a little bit on just kind of our empathic response and listening, and Elizabeth will continue to talk some more about that. But suffice to say that in this process that I'm presenting, that you don't want to always just jump right into goals, but you do need to start off your sessions by carefully listening to people. But if we're not careful, we can listen and empathize with people for an entire hour without much movement. It's kind of like going back to that whole thing about, you know, what did you do this week? You know, that can just open up a pathway where we really just don't go anywhere necessarily. And the key phrases that I want you to take away from today is creating space and finding pathways for movement. So one of those ways is listening for key drivers within a conversation with a person. You know, in one of the sites that I was working with, there was this youth who just had completely shut down with the onset of COVID-19. And, you know, if things weren't bad enough before that time, they now felt even more alone and more isolated and more anxious than before shelter in place. And so a lot of the conversations that they were having were just going nowhere. They were venting sessions and life is bad and I'm giving up and etc. You know, and while the youth could list those countless reasons for why they felt hopeless, the worker was also listening for those key drivers, really kind of thinking about, you know, what would open up some space for movement. And one thing that they hit upon was just that person's desire to learn how to drive. You know, this is just a youth here, and how what was behind that is how it represented this potential pathway to freedom and their eventual ability to be able to work and meet other people. And even though there may have been some obstacles, you know, to taking maybe some steps towards that goal, and, you know, even the person even acknowledging and saying, yes, that's important to me, but well, now that's not going to happen. The key drivers for potential movement were still there. And that's a key thing to really hold with people. Always remembering that it's about just creating space. Next slide, Robin. You know, at some point in these conversations, we do want to find an aim, you know, that takes us from this current point in time that we're at to some point that's outside that session. You know, and that aim could be something that could be far in the future. It could be something that's very immediate. And at this point, we really don't have to have the solution. You know, it is important that we really reserve judgment about what is possible and what's not. So the youth in my example, that drive was just, you know, I want to get my driver's license. But it can also be something, you know, like short term, like I just want to safely be able to buy groceries. You know, it doesn't really always matter sometimes what that aim is, but can it take us to a next point in time? You know, it could be that, you know, that the reason I'm hanging on is because I still want to go to college, or, you know, the thing that really drives me is I want to be able to spend time with my family. You know, maybe not this summer, but I want to be able to go on a vacation with my family, etc. You know, and it's even possible that these aims can coexist, something that we want in the long-term future and something that I need now just to be able to get movement. So also remember to really explore the meaning that people attach to any stated goal, you know, those active ingredients. So if a person verbalizes something like they don't want to feel anxious all the time, you know, we can validate the anxiety that people say, but also really look for possible connections to something that may offer a concrete anchor point for people to aim for. So it might be something, you know, like what I'm hearing is that the anxiety is impacting your ability to spend time with your friends, and you want to be able to do things with them, like go to the movies, you know. So it's acknowledging the anxiety, but it's attaching it to something that might be concrete. Okay. So we talked about the drivers and we've talked about trying to establish that aim. Next slide, Robin. And the next step in that process is really searching for a possible pathway. Now, this is an area that we also need to be careful about unintentionally being over-directive. You know, maybe we do have some great ideas about how a person could accomplish something that they want. You know, maybe we have some creative ideas about how a person could work on a goal like learning to drive, or taking steps to go to college, or seeing a movie with friends. But it is so important to start by eliciting the person's own thinking about their goal. So on the screen are just a few questions that you might ask to create just some space for the person. And I'm sure you have lots of other great questions that you like to ask when you're talking with people to create space. So feel free to type those in the question box so other people can hear it. You know, so much of this, when I think of these questions, is really just keeping the person at the center of their own recovery journey. You know, but there are going to be times, you know, when we talk to people about their ideas and they just have absolutely no clue how to approach something. And I think if we get to that point where we have a difficulty finding a way to elicit something and we just want to create a little space, I think it's fine for us to create some space by asking the person's permission to offer a few suggestions for brainstorming. So it may be just acknowledging the person is saying, yeah, it is kind of difficult right now to think about how someone might approach something like this, you know, considering just the current environment. But would you be open to hearing some ideas that are coming to mind for me? You know, I always like to offer suggestions in the form of an invitation, where it really makes no difference to me if the person accepts it or rejects it. You know, my priority, just as Elizabeth had said earlier, is always leaving choice and autonomy into the hands of the person whose life is being impacted. And it's also fine if neither you or the person has an idea where to start. You know, it's validating that something's important to someone. It's validating that there's that someone holds a value around something, and also being vulnerable and saying, I'm not really sure exactly where to start. You know, sometimes it might be opening up a pathway of saying, you know, would it be helpful if I brought this goal you have to my next group supervision meeting to see if my team has any ideas about possible next steps? You know, I always think about aligning is not always so much even on the goal as it is alignment with the person themselves and what they have important. If we stay at the center of that, we're always going to be in the better place to go in the right direction. Next slide, Robin. So lastly, is coming to the next best step for the person. Now, this may not necessarily be the next step that you want them to take or that you feel most comfortable with. But once again, I think if our goal is staying focused on the person and aligning with them around their goal and their recovery, this is another place to elicit the person's thinking. So just asking a person, you know, so what do you think might need to happen next? You know, or if you have a person who's just a little bit overwhelmed by a goal, they're just not sure. You know, maybe it's you know, saying, well, what would be something that you might feel comfortable or confident doing between now and the next time we get together? You know, so no matter how small we need to make it, it's still presenting a pathway. You know, sometimes people will actually try something that they want to do and it doesn't always go as planned. And sometimes people might be saying that, you know, okay, it's not working, you know, I'm giving up on this. And at that point, you can always just come back to that goal, you know, revisit the goal, revisit the active ingredients, revisit the value that was really driving that goal that was vocalized. And if there's still agreement on any of those planes, you know, exploring, you know, is there something maybe even smaller that you would feel comfortable or confident doing to make movement towards what you want? Or even asking people, you know, what might increase your comfort or confidence to take a next step? Or when something doesn't go well, is there anything that we may have learned from what happened on the step that you took that we might be able to take into a different approach towards this? So once again, it's creating space, it's finding pathways for movement. You know, and even sometimes for people, the best next step for them may be just to pause. You know, maybe it's not always just constant movement and activity. You know, sometimes it's an opportunity for people just to think. And I always like sometimes asking people, you know, well, would it be helpful if you just thought about some of these ideas, or maybe even wrote down some of your reasons of why this goal is important, and then we could revisit this during our next appointment. You know, space can be large, but space can sometimes be small. The importance really is staying aligned with that person. Next slide, Robin. So I just have some final thoughts on a person's recovery journey. Some things I just always want to say is that a setback is not a failure. You know, sometimes things don't go as planned. You know, any of our recovery journeys are not always something that are just perfectly mapped out in the way that they go. You know, and sometimes we have to be careful as workers that we don't get caught in our emotional reaction to what people do or what they don't do, but always leave space for learning and growth, even when things don't go as planned. Another one is that not achieving the specific recovery goal that a person states doesn't diminish the value of the journey itself. You know, people's recovery journeys can veer into so many different pathways that the person may not have envisioned when they stated a goal that they had. And so we really always need to open up space for things to change, for people to reevaluate, for people to decide, you know, this is something I've learned that I don't think that I want, or this has brought me to a point to where I really think this is something that's more valuable to me. Lastly, just that rarely is any person's recovery journey linear. There isn't necessarily a right or wrong pathway, so always leave room for learning and growth along the way, because ultimately the person's life journey is theirs and not ours. So Elizabeth, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thank you, Rick. Let's go to the next slide, Robin. Thank you for those strategies. You left me at a great place to pick up. When Rick and I were talking about the strategies that we have used ourselves and we might be able to offer that could be of help to all of you on the webinar today, I kept using this word and kept thinking of this word, calibrate. I use that word a lot, you know, in terms of calibrating with somebody else. And then when I looked it up, I realized that's not the word. I don't think that's what I meant. I didn't mean, because the calibration almost means getting, you know, sort of in tune with this other sort of stable force. And I realized that sync, like in sync, not like the, you know, 80s boy band, but in sync is really more, it was closer to what I'm thinking of when I think about this. And it's one of the strategies that I use all the time with clients, is to, when I'm feeling sort of stuck, or I feel like I don't know if I'm being helpful, or it seems like perhaps the client I'm working with feels a little stuck, I use this strategy all the time, which is to use, have an opportunity to stop and say, hey, can we get in sync again? Can I get in sync with you again? So go to the next slide, Robin, please. Thank you. So there's like 3 different ways that I've done this and I feel like have been super helpful. One of them is to get in sync around the goals themselves. So this, because of just like all of you who took the poll, you know, almost half of you haven't had a change in your ability to sort of pursue or continue to work on your long-term goals. And, you know, and the rest of us really have. And and even those of you who answered that might have answered another one. So I think this time in our world, all of the changes that have happened, it's a really good time to sit down with somebody and say, hey, I just want to get back in sync about, you know, your goals, and can we talk about this again? And let's get current on what still feels important to you, or what still feels, you know, maybe what's dropped off, or like just can we have a reassessment. And the second one is resyncing around the relationship. I just did this yesterday. With a client where, you know, it's somebody I've seen for a while, and I felt like I was getting like less clear about what how I could be of most support to this person. And I wasn't actually sure if I was helpful to this person. So I wanted to I just said, hey, do you think we could take a few minutes today? I wanted to check in about our relationship. And then it sort of opened up this space and this safety just for me to say, I'm willing to hear anything. It's not going to hurt my feelings. I wanted to just hear a little bit about, you know, how you see this relationship, how I can be most helpful, you know, things I'm doing that are helpful, maybe things that I'm doing that are not, how I could be more helpful, like how is this relationship? And it's also an opportunity for me to say, you know, sometimes I've had some feedback that I've held back on just because I'm not sure about sharing that with you, and here's why, and, you know, what would that look like if I was going to do that? And there's all kinds of things depending on the person that you're talking to and their sort of toleration for what we would call like meta relationship, talking about the relationship within the relationship. But once we open it up and say, can we talk about this for a minute, it provides a sense of safety and a platform to do that. And then the third one is, it really goes with the first one. So if we're sort of sitting down to ask, how are these goals feeling right now? Are there any of these that have shifted during this period of time? One of the things that we can do as helpers is we might help people shift toward higher impact goals that take less effort. So it's one of the classic goal interventions that is super helpful for us too, for anybody, which is if somebody is getting demoralized because it doesn't seem like they're able to get traction or work toward a goal or meet a goal that they wanted to. Whenever we get demoralized or our clients get demoralized, one of the really, really useful, practical, important interventions is to make the goal smaller. All of that stuff about like shoot for the moon, if you miss, you'll land in the stars, and like think big. It's all completely opposite when we look at the research on goal setting. that stuff could not be more inaccurate. It's like cultural mythology that is not helpful, because if I am like, I'm going to exercise every day for 30 minutes, no matter what, on day 2, when I oversleep and I can't do that, I feel like putting the covers over my head because it's demoralizing to fail. And so one of the, this is sort of a motivational interviewing tactic anyway, which is if somebody says, I want to do X, and it seems kind of big to us, we can say to them, seems big, really audacious, love that you're thinking that way. I wonder if there's something much smaller on the way there, that you could set out, because success begets success. So when we sort of, make goals, help people make goals smaller, we wouldn't set them for them. But if we encourage people to make smaller goals and they're able to, and they succeed at those, then that confidence and energy and enthusiasm then leads to more success. Let's go to the next slide. So this last strategy that we're going to talk about, and then we're going to end, and hoping that we can hear from some of you who might have chatted in questions or comments or experiences that you've had. Hopefully that we'll have some time to hear back before we end today. The last thing that I wanted to share is really what I call meaning making. And so meaning making is, it's like it's human. It's what we do as humans. We make meaning of things. We make meaning of events. This is my friend Sylvia, and this is her daughter, Julissa. And Sylvia, she is a physician. She was the chief medical officer of the organization that I worked at for 10 years. And she's my friend, and she's also the person who, in my life, represents this in the most clear way. She has such a fast process of meaning making around hardship or suffering or difficulty. And I also try to be fairly quick about it. She's the quickest. And so I find it really inspiring when I talk to her and something very difficult or a deep hardship or just setbacks or life difficulties has happened, and she sort of acknowledges it and then immediately kind of makes meaning of it. Now, she's very, very Catholic, very religious and very spiritual, both. And so that, I think, can help. Many of our clients may have a worldview that involves religion or spirituality in a sense, that helps them make meaning of things. For others that don't necessarily have that particular way of interacting with this life, there's still meaning that can be made and that we do make out of things. There's some meaning that can be not as fortifying to people. So if the meaning I make out of a hardship is that I'm being punished, or that bad things always happen to me, or that I can just never get ahead, or if I have a religious belief that God is punishing me, those beliefs, there's nothing about beliefs that can be right or wrong. Those beliefs aren't fortifying to us. And so our as helpers, and I would say with friends and kids and family, we can help facilitate helping people make meaning. We can't give it meaning, but we can help them think through what the meaning might be in a way that is supportive and comforting to them. So one of the things that I frequently ask is when people are talking about great difficulties or hardships is I often say, if I know that they have a meaning making sort of way of thinking about things, I'll say, what meaning do you make of that? Like, what are your thoughts about the, the why of that? If I don't know, then I just say, hey, if there, we may not know if there's a larger meaning about things. I mean, if there was, what would it be? And it tends to help people guess around about it. I had someone with terrible, terrible chronic pain who had her identity was completely tied up around work and hard work since childhood. And this chronic debilitating pain had her on full disability and at home and really not even be able to be productive by her own standards at home. And I asked this question, like, I mean, sometimes it must be, we all have different beliefs about whether things have meaning or not. I mean, if there was, what would it be? And she sat for a long time. And then she said to me, I never stopped. I could never stop. I don't prioritize the relationships in my life. I wasn't there when my kids were growing up. I just can never stop working. And she said, I think this is the only thing that could have ever stopped me. And now I am at home. I am there. I am there for my grandkids, And so just with this like little question, she was able to sort of, and then I was sort of in that position of, that lovely position that we get in as helpers when we're like, tell me more, tell me more, tell me more. So let's go to the next slide. I have, there's sort of these 3 steps, I think, as we think about this. There's, a hardship, a setback, difficulties, suffering. And then there's an intersection with values. So one of my really, really deep values is growth. Spiritual growth, personal growth, professional growth is growth. Well, guess what? If that's one of my deepest values, then guess what? Guess what propels the sort of most dramatic growth? Pain, suffering, difficulty. So often when I'm going through something that feels really difficult or feels like a real struggle, I'll remind myself, yeah, this is what I value. This is what's super important to me. I want to grow. I want to change. I want to continue to push forward. Like that is really deeply important to me. So that is the meaning that is the meaning I'm taking from this, that this is really pushing me to change, to grow, etc. So often if we can help people match up what we already know about their values with what might be a setback, suffering, hardship, difficulties in life, then often that leads to being able to make some meaning out of this. And meaning, it probably goes without saying to everyone, when something feels like it has meaning to us, when hardship feels like it has meaning, it's a whole different level of what we're able to tolerate, how it feels to us. I mean, I always say for anybody who's ever lifted weights before or really exercised, if you go back to lifting weights and you've been away for a while, or like me, I pick up at my like 50-year-old age, go to play soccer again when I haven't played in 3 years, then I wake up and I'm incredibly sore and it feels great because the meaning that I'm making of it is exercise and like rigorous, endurance. And I feel good about it. Yes, it hurts. Yes, it's uncomfortable. And I like it. I have a huge toleration for it. If I woke up and exercise was not the cause of that pain, I would have a whole different level of probably anger about the pain, that it was impairing me from what I wanted to do. I would probably have a ton of fear about the pain. And I might even have shame about the pain, what's wrong with me, what's wrong with my body. And that is true of emotional pain too. We have a whole different level of tolerance and self-compassion around pain and difficulty when it has some meaning to us. And with that, I'm going to stop and to hand it back over to Jen.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth, and thank you so much, Rick. Once again, really, just wonderful, wonderful presentations. We have a couple of minutes for questions, and so I'm going to pose one question and actually ask this to both of you. And we can start with you, Rick. So obviously many of our participants are working in county organizations, and this question came up in different ways. How do we implement these techniques and catch ourselves from being fearful, judgmental, impatient when we're not working in a private practice and we have many unavoidable performance requirements that are given to us by the county that don't necessarily align with our values or our patients' values? What are some real strategies and techniques to address that dilemma?
Well, that's an easy one. Just kidding. I'm just joking.
Yeah. Well, it's a great question, and actually there's so many ways that you could answer that, I don't know how we could unpack all of it. Probably its most simplistic is the fact is that, you know, even when we work in an organization where there are restrictions to things that we can do, there always is a space that we own. You know, even if it's the space that I have with 1 hour with this person, you know, there's a lot that I can take control in terms of being able to open up space and opportunities. You know, we always have to work within the parameters of what we've been given. But I think what we always have to think about is that if I have an hour with a person and I know what this goal is, where is it that I can align with them? You know, it may be that, you know, I'm community-based. It may be that I'm office-based. You know, we can't make something out of what we don't have. But I always just think about, we just have to start with is that, how am I impacting things and what is it that I can control within the space that I do have?
Excellent. Thank you, Rick. Elizabeth, any other perspectives on that question?
You know what? I love the question. I mean, that's the reason I joked about it. It was such a deep, important question. I really appreciate what you said, Rick, as just looking where we can align. And I just have a lot of empathy for that question, because I feel like sometimes, you know, I've certainly worked in organizations where I thought the assessments were terrible. We're just, you know, driving pathology, and, you know, where it was like sort of what I was asked to do was even sort of at odds, even though the organization was largely consistent with my larger mission and values, that the actual strategies I had to do were crosswise with that. And I've also worked in substance use disorder treatment for many, many, many years. And I think I relate to that from the perspective of when someone is there involuntarily, you know, and we have to talk to their probation officer regularly, and, you know, sort of wondering how to figure out how to connect and all of that. And so I just want to say there's nothing easy about that. And I feel like the human to human connection, it isn't the solution to all of those more complex things. It is sort of the antidote, though. Like, it is the sort of glass of water when we're really thirsty, is to try to get through the system sort of barriers, and really align and say, you know, this hat where I have to ask all these questions, or this what we have to do, like, that doesn't really feel right to me right now, considering what you're going through. Why don't we leave 10 minutes at the end for that? And I really want to hear, you know, what's happening right now. Like, figure out a way to really just connect as humans in that moment, outside of our roles in some ways. And having said all that, I'm guessing the person who asked the question does that a lot, or wouldn't have asked the question. So I appreciate it.
So thank you so much. We had webinar that was packed full of really good information, and so we don't have as much time today for questions. But any questions that we do receive will go to Elizabeth, and they'll go to Rick, and they will take time to answer them in writing, and they'll be posted to our website. So thank you so much, Rick. Thank you so much, Elizabeth. Really enjoyed having you today.
Thank you.
Really, thank you. Really also want to thank the California Healthcare Foundation, because they're sponsoring this series.